Thank you very much, Hans. It's very nice to be here, and thank you very much to RAP and to Leonardo Energy for the opportunity to talk here. Good afternoon to you all, or good morning, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. That's one of the great benefits of webinar technology, isn't it? For those of you I don't know, my name's Nick Eyre. I'm director of the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions in the UK, which is UK Research and Innovation's biggest university-based research programme on energy demand and energy efficiency. The title of my talk today is Let's Get to Work, the Zero Carbon Energy Transition. And I hope the meaning and the relevance of the Let's Get to Work part of the title will be clearer by the end, but at least at the beginning, it's clear we're talking about the zero carbon energy transition. And obvious to most of you, I suspect, but a transition to a zero carbon or very close to zero carbon energy system is essential if the world is to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that was confirmed in the recent IPCC assessment. Right, this always happens, Hans. My screen is frozen and I can't get to the next slide. Do you have any suggestions? Oh, there we go. It's working. So the aims of my talk today are to do a couple of things. The first is to persuade you of two things. The first is that getting to zero carbon energy systems requires a major change in the thermodynamics of the energy system, moving essentially from using heat to using work. And second, that will allow big increases in the efficiency with which we use energy. Sorry for the misprint there in that dot point. You always see that as soon as you start presenting, don't you? And then I want to leave some time at the end to share some questions about the implications for policy and regulation, because I think with this audience, I hope to learn from you as well as you hopefully learning from me. Before starting, I should acknowledge the funding that this research is based on from, as I said, from UK Research and Innovation for the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. And if you want to read the full paper, it's published in Energy Efficiency. The details are there. The paper is called From Using Heat to Using Work, Reconceptualizing the Zero Carbon Energy Transition, because you can't use such a snappy title as we've got for this talk in papers in general. Let's start by thinking about what we mean by energy systems. So the most common representation of an energy system, many of you will have seen, is the Sankey diagram. Energy of different types flows through the energy system, starting from the left-hand side, the sources of fuels, through to the right-hand side, the users of energy. And here the line widths denote the amount of energy that's flowing, and the colors denote the original fuel, with red for coal there, green for renewables, blue for oil, etc. And this is I've chosen the representation here for the EU 28, but you can do that for any size of energy system that you choose. It seems to me there's three things problematic or unsatisfactory about this representation. The first and probably most important is that it ignores what we actually use energy for. It ignores the purposes of the energy system, the energy services that it provides. The second is that it treats all types of energy as being of equal value, and I'll come back to why that's important and not true. And the third is it's actually quite complicated. It's a complex diagram, and if you want to think through what's needed to move to a zero carbon system, is probably helpful to work with something a little simpler. So to address those issues, firstly, I'm going to make some changes to the representation. The first is to add energy services on the right-hand side. So we won't end with the energy that goes to final users, we end with the energy services that they consume. So comfort, mobility, those sorts of things. And that sounds a very sensible thing to do. And you might wonder why most people who use a Sankey diagram don't do that. And the reason is that it messes up with your line widths. The lines on a Sankey diagram are measured in energy units, and many energy services aren't measured in energy units. You don't measure comfort or mobility in energy units. So it's actually quite difficult to do whilst preserving the line widths as a metric. So in my representation, I'm going to abandon those line widths as well. And then the third change that I'm going to try to adopt in my representation is to think about the thermodynamics of the system. Don't panic. For those of you who are not physical scientists, the thermodynamics is not really very difficult, and I will explain it. Let me start by saying that what I'm trying to do is show that all energy is not equal, and in particular, we'll come to the point that electricity and work are more valuable than other forms of energy. Just thought I'd throw in a random quote from Einstein, always a nice thing to do in a talk, gives it spurious credibility. Einstein said that classical thermodynamics is the only physical theory of universal content that will never be overthrown. So I think we can assume that thermodynamics is here to stay and worth thinking about. All the thermodynamics that you need to know to get something out of this talk is summarized in this slide. Those of you who know something about thermodynamics will recognize the representation on the right hand side of flows of heat and work from one temperature to another, and the way that they interact. For those of you who are less familiar, the basic thing that you need to know are that there are two types of energy, heat and work. And you could think of those as heat as being a sort of microscopic energy. It's actually to do with the vibration of atoms within matter. That's what heat is. Whereas other forms of energy, which we call work, are to do with macroscopic energy. So that's the energy that something has because it's moving, or because it's in an electric field, or it's in a gravitational field. And these two types of energy have different characteristics. But the first law of thermodynamics tells us that heat and work can be converted into each other, and that energy is always conserved. So the sum total of the heat and work in a closed system remains constant. And then the important second law of thermodynamics tells us about the conversion efficiencies between heat and work. And the critical finding, the critical point of the second law, is that work can be converted into heat more efficiently than heat can be converted into work. And almost everything I'm going to say in this talk that is the critical point, and it has much more implications for the energy transition than I think most people have recognized. So having adopting those changes and thinking in particular about representing heat and work in my modified Sankey diagram. This is my modified Sankey diagram. So the line thicknesses no longer have any meaning. Energy services have been added on the right-hand side, and rather than segment by fuel, by coal, oil, gas, I'm segmenting by heat and work. And heat and work are relevant both to the energy sources on the left-hand side and the energy services on the right-hand side. And I'm just here for convenience representing heat in red and work in green. So some energy sources, the fossil fuels obviously, but biomass, nuclear, geothermal as well, tend to provide heat. We burn the fuel in some sense, and it's the heat that we get out that's useful. Whereas other sources of energy, notably hydropower, wind, and solar photovoltaics, produce work, which tends to be in the form of electricity. And then on the right-hand side of the diagram, the energy services similarly can be split into things that require heat and things that require work. So energy services like space heating, washing, cooking, etc., but also steam raising, melting in industry require heat. And some other things require work or power, stationary power, moving things around in factories, but also transportation. But increasingly other things, data processing, electrochemistry, also require work directly. And the energy system is what links the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And in some cases, there are relatively straightforward conversions. So you can burn a fuel and get heat out of it, or you can generate electricity with one of the renewables and use that to run an electric motor, for example. But it's more complicated if you want to use heat to provide work, or you want to use work to provide heat, and that's what all the complexity in the middle of the diagram is about. So that's why we talk about energy systems and why they're complex. It wasn't always like that. If we think back to the Industrial Revolution, which began, well, about 250 years ago in the country I'm in, and a bit more recently in some other places, the heat systems and work systems were essentially separated. If you wanted a heat-based energy service, you burnt something, normally biomass, but some fossil fuels were used already, using pretty basic processes like open fires or candles or lamps. If you wanted work, you wanted to move something, usually, you could use the early forms of renewable energy, windmills, water mills, but normally it was an animal, a human animal, or an animal trained by humans that was used. Basically, if you wanted some work, you did it yourself. And that's, of course, why the name work was adopted, because it was to do with human labor. That was the origin of the word. So what happened in the Industrial Revolution essentially was that those old sources of work were largely displaced, not completely, of course, as shown in this diagram. This is a stereotype, not an actual full representation. And that heat sources displaced those work sources. So initially through coal and steam engines, but later through internal combustion engines using petroleum and the generation of electricity. The way that we provided all energy services relied largely on burning things. So we had a very heat source based energy system, and that's the energy system essentially that we still have in large measure. It explains the current global energy system quite well. And if you look then at the breakdown of how we use energy globally, we use about 400 exajoules of energy. That's about 10,000, about 100,000 terawatt hours for those of you who prefer those sorts of units. And in this diagram, I've separated it into the three main uses of energy in industry, buildings, and transport, and split it between fuels, all fuels, and electricity. And in essence, heat is largely provided by the direct combustion of fossil fuels, and work is provided either by electricity in buildings and industry, or by liquid fuels in internal combustion engines in transport. Electricity itself, of course, is largely still generated from fossil fuels, but it only provides 26% of the world's final energy, most of our final energy is direct use of fossil fuels. And that's really the critical point for the zero carbon transition. We just cannot go on like that. If we're going to stabilize the climate, we need to decarbonize energy supply, and that means changing away from fossil fuels at the point of use. The crucial insight is that decarbonizing electricity is necessary, but it is far from sufficient, because electricity only provides a small proportion of our final energy, and a much bigger challenge is decarbonizing the rest of our energy system. So the way people are beginning to think about the energy transition is as a multi-stage systemic change. First, of course, we need to use low carbon energy sources to replace fossil fuels in power generation. And because of the huge improvements in cost that we're seeing in some of those renewables, and the diagram there on the right-hand side shows what's happened to the cost of solar over a few decades. We are beginning to see fossil fuels displaced in power generation, not sufficiently quickly for many of us, but it is beginning to happen. But as I said, that alone is not sufficient to get us to a zero carbon energy system. We are then going to need to go through some more steps. First, to convert end users that require work to electricity. Electric vehicles are critical to that, as I showed earlier. We're already using electricity to provide most of our work in buildings and in industry, but we're not in transport. So electric vehicles are the way to do that. And then we will need to convert heating where possible to electricity. And the efficient way to do that, of course, is via heat pumps. And then last but not least, and probably most difficult, are the end users where electrification, for one reason or another, is not feasible. And these are things like aviation, marine, some industrial processes. And there we are going to need to substitute fossil fuels with some other final fuel. Hydrogen, ammonia, other synthetic fuels. There's a variety of things under discussion, as many of you will know. But I think that's a more useful way to think about the low carbon energy transition, the zero carbon energy transition, than just thinking about the fuels on the left-hand side of the Sankey diagram. And in essence, if you look at those 4 steps, the first, well, we're getting on with it reasonably well in many countries. The second, the electrification of vehicles, is clearly beginning to happen, gaining pace in many places. The third, electrification of heat, very early days. And the fourth, what to do where we can't use electricity. Really, we're nowhere in that story at the moment. So a mixed picture. If we can do all of those, what sort of energy system do we end up with? Well, in essence, one that looks a bit like this. We were getting most of our energy from those work-producing renewable energy sources, hydropower, wind, and solar. Not all of it, of course. It's unreasonable to think that it will be all of it, but the system will be dominated by those fuels in the way that it's historically been dominated by the heat-producing fuels. So the change from an industrial revolution system to a post-carbon system is huge, is very, very fundamental. We're moving from one set of fuels that produce heat to another set of energy sources that produce work. And that, of course, has implications throughout the energy system, rather than being reliant on as much on engines and on boilers. We're going to be looking at electricity through motors, electricity then used for heating through heat pumps, or electricity used to make synthetic fuels like hydrogen, which can then be used either for heating or in transportation. So very fundamental change, but not just in which fuels they are, but actually in this rather fundamental thermodynamic way of moving away from heat and moving towards work. What does this all imply for energy efficiency? Well, in those 4 stages, we go through them one by one. If we eliminate fossil fuels and replace them by renewables in power generation, that doesn't have a direct impact on the efficiency of final energy use, but it certainly increases primary energy efficiency. If we move from to electric motors rather than heat engines in vehicles, that's a big increase in energy efficiency because motors are more efficient than internal combustion engines. Similar effect in low temperature heating. If we can move to heat pumps away from boilers, a big increase in efficiency. And actually the same if we rely on a manufactured fuel like hydrogen. Often that can be used in more efficiently than existing fuels, at least at the point of end use. There is a penalty in the production, an efficiency penalty in the production of that hydrogen. So the one negative we might expect to see in terms of overall energy efficiency in this sort of transition is due to the loss in the loss in efficiency in producing those sort of synthetic fuels. So overall, it looks like this is good news for the energy efficiency of the overall energy system if we can move towards a renewable-based, work-based system. How much is the next question? And to answer that, what I did in the paper that I'm describing here today is essentially conducted a thought experiment which said, well, okay, if we move in the way that we've described towards a system driven by work producing energy sources, how much does that allow us to improve energy efficiency? So I made some assumptions. They are quite simplistic assumptions. We'll say that we are relying on a system where 100% of our energy comes from work-producing energy sources. The end use is electrified wherever that's possible, and that where it's not possible, energy is provided by hydrogen, which is itself provided through electrolysis. I've also assumed that demand for energy services is constant, and that the only efficiency improvements we will see are those that are enabled by fuel switching rather than by better control or insulation or all the other ways of improving energy efficiency. So I'm not pretending these are realistic assumptions. It is very definitely a thought experiment rather than a scenario. If you like, it's a sort of exploration of what the type of transition that I'm thinking about will lead to in terms of the efficiency of energy use by looking at a most exaggerated version of it. And then to do the actual calculations, to be honest, this is the boring bit of the work. Excuse me. What I did was divided global energy demand into different categories of energy use to provide different energy services, so space heating, freight transport, etc. Then in each case, looked at the current energy system, what the shares of demand is, and which can be electrified, and assume that where they can be electrified, they are, and where they can't, the remainder is supplied by hydrogen. And then for each end-use fuel combination, estimated the final energy conversion efficiency in the existing energy system, and what the final conversion efficiencies might be in a post-carbon transition energy system. And then by subtracting the two, calculate the change in demand that we get by moving from a heat-based system up to a work-based system, and then add up the numbers across the whole to calculate the global total. So this, as I say, was quite laborious. It required looking at a large number of papers in the existing literature, but overall, I think it's a reasonably reliable way of looking at how final energy use might change. The top line results probably more interesting than the methodology. So the diagram here shows the current split of energy use between industry, buildings and transport, which is the same as a diagram that I showed you earlier, split between fuels in blue and electricity in red. And then the right-hand side is what I project in the post-carbon transition system in the same three categories. Red for electricity again, blue is for fuels, but in this case, the fuel is electrolytic hydrogen. The assumption that I mentioned earlier, I've just repeated on the top right-hand corner of the slide there for so that you can see them again. The results, I think, stand out pretty starkly on the graph itself. Final energy demand over the three sectors put together is reduced by 40%. It's more than 50% effect in buildings and transport. And critically, electricity's share of final demand rises from 26% to about 77%. And of course, those two results are strongly related to each other. It is the fact that electricity's share of final demand goes up and that electricity can be used far more efficiently than fossil fuels that leads directly to this reduction in final energy demand. And in essence, it's not a very surprising conclusion, but it is one I don't think that anybody had done before I sat down and did it in its entirety across all end users within the global energy system. If you look in a bit more detail, so I've split industry, buildings and transport down into with a bit more granularity in each of those sectors. So for example, in buildings, split between space heating, water heating, cooking and lights and appliances. The existing system and its split is at the top of the diagram, the post-carbon transition split at the bottom. And you see, of course, that electricity becomes dominant in many more categories of end use, and essentially only some high temperature processes, freight transport, aviation and marine are using significant amounts of hydrogen. The key insights are that energy demand falls due to electrification, except in those categories that are already 100% electrified. Demand falls most in road vehicles due to electrification, in heating in buildings due to heat pumps, and perhaps more surprisingly for those of us in the global north, in cooking, but a lot of this is due to the reduction in biomass use in the global south. Much of the change is therefore, as I said, due to the widespread use of electric cooking vehicles and heat pumps with hydrogen much more concentrated in a few areas. If we think about the slightly unrealistic assumptions that I made to start with and then sort of discuss those, of course, it means that conversion efficiency isn't the only variable. Other efficiency changes can be quite significant, notably by improving building fabric and moving to more efficient modes as opposed to just more efficient vehicle traction systems in transport. So switching to cycling and walking, switching to public transport instead of private cars largely. Some social changes may reduce demand for some energy services. We're already seeing lesser use of materials through circular economy type measures. We're seeing more sharing through digitally enabled platforms. But on the other hand, we would expect rising incomes, particularly in poorer communities, to continue to drive demand upwards for energy services. both for the basic services in poorer communities, but also for luxury goods and services, notably aviation. And the bottom line of the sort of overall effect you might then get adding all these things together. The diagram on the right-hand side is taken from a paper by Arnulf Grubler and his colleagues who've looked at low energy demand scenarios for the world. And their conclusion was that we can get global energy demand down from its current level of about 400 exajoules down to something like 250 exajoules. So reasonably consistent with the results that I've come up with in this paper. We can look at these things in a bit more detail at the national level. So I'm just here briefly introducing some results from some work by colleagues in CREDS on looking at the UK, and we've found that in plausible low energy demand scenarios for the UK that deliver net zero, we can reduce energy use by between 30 and 50% by 2050. And it's worth setting out, so the diagram on the right-hand side shows 4 scenarios. The higher line is where there's no policy action and no transition, essentially, and then the 3 others are scenarios that are compliant with net zero by 2050. And if that's done with minimal social and behavioral change, simply by adopting cost-effective energy efficiency and decarbonising energy supply, you get a 30% reduction in energy demand, and this is largely due to the efficiency improvements of electrification. If we add in the possible social and behavioural changes, not so much flying, better use of public transport, better improvement of building efficiency, etc., then energy demand can fall by as much as 50% by 2050, which is would leave UK energy demand per capita at a level that is lower than the current global average. So we think that that living standards in the UK could rise and still our energy use fall to well below current global average levels, which I think will be a surprising result for many people. So my conclusions are that in post-carbon energy systems, the main sources are going to be those that produce work and not heat. And as I say, that's in many ways obvious, but is often not stated in that way. And I think stating in that way leads you to think about the thermodynamics. And if you do that, you realize that there are some profound effects. Final energy will be dominated by electricity and to a lesser extent some other synthetic fuels like hydrogen. And this implies major changes, not just in the fuels that we use, but how we use energy at the point of final use. The key technologies are going to be electric vehicles and heat pumps, and they will allow more efficient use of energy by about 40%, so a massive effect. And the overall message from that is, I think that shifts to renewables and energy efficiency are not independent. There are strong synergies. And I think we've known half of that story for some time. We've known for a long time that if we improve energy efficiency, reduce demand, that makes it easier to electrify and bring in renewables to the energy system. Because it's a smaller energy system, it's easier to do. But the results of the piece of work that I'm talking to you about today also say that works in the other direction, that if we can move to this renewable work-based energy system, that allows energy efficiency to improve as well. And so there's this strong virtuous circle can be established between renewables, electrification, and improvements in energy efficiency, a synergy, because there's support in both directions. And then I'll just leave you with some thoughts about things that we don't know, because I don't think we do yet know fully what what the implications are for policy and regulation. We know we need to move to a world where transportation and heating are more electrified. And that has some fairly obvious policy implications that we do know. But how do we incentivize options that are efficient within that system? How do we avoid having vehicles that aren't the electric version of gas guzzlers, if you see what I mean? Or how do we avoid having unnecessarily high electricity use in vehicles, in transportation, by having heat pumps or electric vehicles that are inefficient? And then secondly, an issue that I know many of you will be familiar with, but I haven't really touched on here because I haven't looked at temporal granularity. What about peak loads? We know that particular heating will be peaked, that vehicle charging can be strongly peaked if everybody chooses to charge at the same time of day, and that obviously has a lot of problematic implications for the electricity system. So those questions of time and efficiency, I think, which have always been there in the energy system, are particularly are going to continue and be magnified in this new system. And so I'm going to leave it there. I think I'll just leave up those questions because that might help stimulate discussion and debate.